All
Hello,
right.
everyone. My name is Tara Moran. I'm a librarian at the Mastic Merchant Shirley Community Library. Thank you for joining us for tonight's monthly library program from the National Park Service. Today, we will explore the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness area in our program, The Wilderness in Your Backyard. And tonight, we're joined by Park Ranger Kelsey Cecina. Now, if you have any questions throughout this program, please enter them in the chat box. We will have time at the end to ask questions and we'll monitor the chat box. And if it fits, I'll ask Kelsey your question. And so, Kelsey, if you're ready, please tell us all about our local wilderness.
Yeah. We spoke a little bit, Tara, about this subject, and we just want to make sure as we move into the program that everyone's aware that we're going to be talking about the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness area, which is a very special place. Today, I'm going to be talking all about what it means for a place to be a federal wilderness, what kind of regulations manage that place, and really like what wilderness is and what makes it special. So we're not necessarily going to be talking about like backyard wildernesses, although I'm more than happy to talk about the landscape on Long Island and all of the natural things we have going on here. But what today we're going to focus in on is the Fire Island Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness and just the idea of wilderness more broadly. So I have a slideshow I'm going to share with you guys. Just give me a quick moment to set that up. And hopefully you're seeing just the slide, not my notes.
Yes, slide.
Looks good. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey. I'm a park ranger, if that's not already obvious, from Fire Island National Seashore. This is, I think, my third or fourth program I've done with Mastic Shirley, and I'm really excited to be back. This is like sort of my hometown, and we're always really happy to talk to you folks. We're really fortunate to live where we do and to have access to the spaces that we have access to. And of course, there are all sorts of things that make the Tri-Hamlet area so special. There's a lot of human history here. There are a lot of wonderful parks. And one really neat thing about where we live is that it's close to New York State's only federal wilderness area. And that wilderness area is the thing that we're going to be talking about today, as well as trying to get at the idea of what wilderness is more broadly. So when we ask ourselves the question of what wilderness is, I think it can be difficult to get a solid answer. Lots of people have lots of different ideas about what wilderness is. Wilderness, I think, is a really loaded term. For many Americans, wilderness is sort of best understood as like undeveloped and natural land. But when we're talking about wilderness, in this context, we may sometimes find ourselves making incorrect assumptions about what and who makes a wilderness, about what and who lived on and appreciated these places and these lands first. Many of the best known wilderness areas within the United States are not, in fact, untouched, which is a word that comes up a lot when we're talking about wilderness, as we're sometimes led to believe. Many of these places are actually have this long history of human habitation as the ancestral lands of many Americans over the course of sometimes thousands of years. So while the framework for wilderness sometimes fails to fully account for the long presence of humans within the natural landscapes, a history that goes back long before like colonial Europeans arrived here, it may be fair to say that there are some spaces that are special. And that's what I think of when I think of wilderness. It's this place that's sort of special. But why and what makes a wilderness area so special? So the question I would ask is, what do we think of when we think of wilderness? There are lots of words that might come to mind when we think of wilderness, maybe uncontrolled, uncharted, magnificent. Oftentimes we think of wildernesses as these beautiful, wide open, gorgeous spaces. Undeveloped is a word that we'll be talking about a little later. Oftentimes wilderness areas are very beautiful. Sometimes they feel very ancient, sort of primeval. Untouched is maybe a word that comes up too, and I think we'll be talking about that a little later. Wild is a good word. There's a great quote by Henry David Thoreau. He said, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And that's something I hold to and think about a lot when I'm thinking about wildernesses. Natural and primitive are also words that that come up. The truth is the definition of wilderness can be as elusive as wilderness itself, as hard to find as a good wilderness space, because we each have our own definition of what belongs to wilderness, of what the idea of wilderness is supposed to convey. The fact that the word wilderness itself is subjective is itself a testament to the power of this idea of wilderness and the sort of place that that holds in our spiritual lives. These are places that are important and valuable to us as human beings, but for reasons that are not often monetary in nature, they sort of transcend monetary value in many cases. And like I said, like Henry David Thoreau said, these are places where the world is preserved. But of course, it's hard to preserve wilderness from encroaching development when all we have are subjective definitions of the word wilderness. I'm a park ranger. I work for the National Park Service, which means I work for the government. And when I'm working for the government, I like to think about laws, rules, and things like that. It just comes with the job. So because wilderness is such a loaded and amorphous concept, it becomes really necessary to try to make it into something solid in some ways. So here in the United States, we often turn to legislation in an attempt to preserve some of what we would call wilderness spirit. This is a photo from 1964 when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act into law. The Wilderness Act was really important. It provided a legal framework for the designation and preservation of tracts of relatively pristine natural lands to be termed as wilderness areas, managed as federal wildernesses. These areas, formally designated by Congress by any number of acts of laws, sort of are protected under the authority of a bunch of different federal agencies, including the National Park Service, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The protection and preservation of wilderness actually, in many cases and in many ways, exceeds the regulatory framework that is even devised for national parks, except when and where national parks contain wildernesses. So it's almost like you have a park, and parks are to be preserved as these special places, and then there are wildernesses inside of parks that are even afforded an even higher level of protection. As with the history of the National Park Service more broadly, the history of federal wildernesses is something of a post-expansionary artifact, right? So we think about a time, 1964, when the United States had sort of fully expanded from coast to coast, from the Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It had begun to rapidly develop and suburbanize the West. And there were all of these fears and thoughts about the role that wilderness played in our lives, and a great sense of urgency sort of started to arise. The Wilderness Act helped to set aside at least some of that land that was being developed from development, ensuring that future generations would be able to continue to enjoy these wildernesses, to be present within these wildernesses. So what is wilderness? The Wilderness Act is really convenient because the Wilderness Act gives us a very straightforward, although it's actually not very straightforward when we look at it closely, definition of what a wilderness is. So it says, a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled, important word we'll talk about later, untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. An area of wilderness is further defined to mean in this act an area of undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation, which is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions, and which, one, generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable. Two, has outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Three, has at least 5,000 acres of land or is of sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation and use in an unimpaired condition. We'll come back to that a little later on, because 5,000 acres is a funny number when we think about how small Fire Island's wilderness area is. And four, may also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, and historic value. So we see that even the Wilderness Act defines wilderness in somewhat vague ways. It uses all these words that we have to then go in and start thinking about and defining. We get words like untrammeled, like primitive. These are very subjective terms. They can mean something a little different to everyone. But what is important is that the value of wilderness is in some ways intangible. You know, wildernesses aren't just about what we can touch, what we can take. They're also about our experiences. They're also about the intangible things that we get out of, you know, wildernesses when we visit. These are spaces that derive their value from what they provide people in terms of enjoyment, in terms of recreation, in terms of revitalization. I always feel really energized when I visit the wilderness, not necessarily in terms of all of those things like raw materials and real estate and other commodities. Section 2 of the Wilderness Act, Part A, gives justification for the establishment of wilderness and is in its own way very telling of what wildernesses represent. And I'm sorry for doing a lot of law right now, but I do think it's really interesting to look at the legal framework and how we understand these things. In order to assure, and it reads, in order to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. So to me, this section is really telling. It helps us to better understand the specific conditions across the country that led to the recognition of the intrinsic values of wilderness, of why wilderness was going to be important in our lives. It also betrays this underlying anxiety, which the designation of wilderness areas seeks to alleviate, this fear of development. Increasing population is a word that's used, expanding settlement, growing mechanization. These are all themes we're familiar with here in our own communities every single day. And sometimes when we're feeling overwhelmed by all of these things, wilderness can act as this lovely escape. It gives us a way, you know, to reconnect with ourselves and to reconnect with our space around us outside of mechanization, you know, outside of our phones and all that stuff, outside of hopefully computers. I hope to see you guys out at the wilderness someday. So in the Fire Island Wilderness, for example, you can participate in a number of different recreational activities. There are folks who hike there. We go camping, fishing. There's waterfowl hunting. You can do photography. I'm a photographer myself. I took this picture last week. I'm really proud of it. You can go bird watching, stargazing. Stargazing is one of my favorite things to do out in the wilderness. You can go kayaking. You can even go horseback riding if you feel like it. I met a gentleman last week who was cross-country skiing, which was really cool right after the snowstorm had fallen. So maybe cross-country skiing is something you'd consider, and a host of other activities. This is important because as it's outlined in the Wilderness Act, wilderness areas shall be devoted to the public purposes of recreational, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historical use. So it's important because wildernesses aren't exactly set aside for us to be away from, for us to never have access to or touch. There are places that we're supposed to use and places that we're supposed to enjoy. So it may be easier to define wildernesses, however, not necessarily by what you can do there. Maybe it's a little easier to think about what is prohibited, the sort of things that you can't do. The Wilderness Act reads, except when necessary, to meet the minimum requirements for administration of the area for the purpose of this act, there shall be no temporary road, no use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment, or motorboats, no landing of aircraft, no other form of mechanical transport, and no structure or installation within any such area. So you can't build in a wilderness, you can't drive through a wilderness, you can't run your motorboats through a wilderness, you can't fly onto a wilderness. Wildernesses are free from all of the engines, all of these things that make a lot of noise. So they can be quite quiet, and that's one of the pleasant things about them. There are a lot of rules regulating what you can do in wilderness, as free and open as wildernesses are for folks who want to recreate and enjoy themselves. So a priority within any federal wilderness is the question of access. Would it make sense to take these wildernesses, to fence them off, make them totally inaccessible to the public, make it so that you can't visit a wilderness? I don't know how much sense that makes, because how are you supposed to enjoy a place if you're not able to visit and if you're not able to recreate within it? How then would we enjoy the benefits of wilderness? There's no other way. The Wilderness Act, concerned about this question, lays out a framework for providing access to these wild spaces, saying that wildernesses, quote, shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such manner as will leave them unimpaired, really important, for future use as wilderness, and so as to provide for the protection of these areas, the preservation of their wilderness character. To me, that phrase wilderness character is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. So let's take a look at that for a minute. Let's think, what exactly is wilderness character? As most people conceptualize wilderness, they often do it through the lens of, through three different lenses. First, they think of the biophysical idea. This is the lens that many naturalists and scientists might approach when they're considering wilderness. Through this lens, a wilderness is defined by its natural and environmental makeup. That is, it's defined mainly by the physical features present within the wilderness. They may be geographical forms like dunes or mountains or bogs or rivers or lakes. A wilderness might have some or all of those things. It might have none of those things. It might be very different from the wilderness that we have here, very different from wildernesses you'll see in Alaska. They're all unique in their own ways. This is one reason why, for example, we do not build artificial dunes within Fire Island National Seashore, within the wilderness here on Fire Island, because we want to make sure that a wilderness has some of these things that they're naturally occurring and that they have not been artificially altered, created, or impaired by people. So we also don't want to destroy our dunes artificially. Biophysical idea. I don't know why I included a picture of poison ivy. I think it's a really pretty picture of poison ivy, but we do have a lot of poison ivy. Another framework for understanding wilderness might be the experiential idea. This is a second lens through which a lot of people approach wilderness. Through this, we think of campers, we think of hikers, we think of hunters, we think of fishermen, and we think of how they might look at a wilderness through this specific lens. These are people who seek places that offer them outdoorsy experiences, campsites off the beaten path, where headlights don't bother you in the middle of stargazing at night, or where motorboats won't scare away all the best fish. Viewed through an experiential lens, we see that wilderness offers us opportunities to experience what is often really elusive in our everyday lives. That is the wonder and awe at being exposed to nature, to something greater than the human hand, and really to participate in activities that allow us to do that. The last sort of lens. Cool, thank you. Got it. All right, can you guys see my slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about the symbolic idea. I'm so sorry about the technical trouble. Part of the reason why I really like wildernesses is that you can just sort of visit them and be in them without having to worry about your computer's security updates. So let's talk a little bit about the symbolic idea. This is maybe the lens through which people who can't access a physical wilderness, people who aren't actually able to go inside of the wildernesses, this is maybe the lens that they look at it through, folks who maybe live in cities like New York City. I know for myself that I've never had the opportunity to visit a place like Molly Beatty Wilderness in Alaska. That's one of the largest wildernesses, actually the largest wilderness in the wilderness system. It's over 12,000 square miles. It's the largest federal wilderness area in the United States. The idea of that place, even though I can't visit it, although I'm sure I could if I put a little effort in, the idea of it is really important to me, though. I know that that wilderness is supporting a wonderful ecosystem, that it's creating oxygen that maybe I breathe, that it's doing all sorts of things that are good for me on a physical level, and of course on a symbolic level. Whenever I'm away from the wilderness, just knowing that it's there can be a source of comfort, can be something that makes me feel better, maybe when I'm walking through the streets of New York City. So the symbolic value of the symbolic idea of wilderness is also really important to us in our day-to-day lives. The Wilderness Act is wilderness character is defined in the Wilderness Act a couple of specific ways. It uses a couple of specific really important terms that we will go over real quick. It uses the word untrammeled. No, so what does that untrammeled mean? It uses the word natural. It uses the word undeveloped, and it says that wildernesses have outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined types of recreation. So let's look at the first one, untrammeled. Well, the dictionary definition of untrammeled says not deprived of freedom of action or expression, not restricted or hampered. Meaning that wilderness is essentially unhindered, that it's free from human control and manipulation. And when you walk through a wilderness, especially if you walk through the wilderness in the middle of the summer and you're slapping yourself because there are mosquitoes everywhere, you start to get the idea that, yeah, maybe this place is a little unrestricted. It's free, it's wild, and it's free from human manipulation. That's one of the things that is important to wilderness, that it remains untrammeled. Looking at the dictionary definition of the word natural is a little easier to understand. It's defined as existing in or caused by nature, not made or caused by humankind. So there's this dichotomy that comes into play here. When we're thinking of wilderness, we're thinking of things that are natural. We're thinking of nature, we're thinking of natural, we're thinking of things that exist outside of human confines, right? Though many wildernesses have long human histories that go back thousands of years, they were not necessarily created by people, nor were they altered in noticeable or permanent ways. And that is really important. Put simply, wilderness maintains ecological systems that are substantially free from the effects of modern civilization, of the lives that we live today. Though its definition is concise, undeveloped, not having been developed. Undeveloped is a pretty loaded term. It begs the questions, undeveloped by who? As many wilderness landscapes have histories of human habitation and development of some kind or another, if only in subtle ways, right? The way we manage rivers might be, and the impact that has on wildernesses outside of those management areas, could that be considered a kind of development? Our wilderness is a great example of this conundrum. As even as recently as its establishment in the 1980s, humans developed the land to a very small degree. There were, at the time of the establishment of the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness, several settlements, small summer communities that were brought out and removed, that were bought out and removed in order to create the wilderness. Though those communities have since been disbanded and nobody lives out in the wilderness anymore, the remnants of those old buildings can still be discovered if you know where to look. Sometimes you come across their foundations, you can see them around. So is that still undeveloped? The wilderness is essentially considered to be undeveloped. We may also look at it as something that can be de-developed, is the word that I would use, in the sense that wilderness, quote, retains its primeval character and influence and is essentially without permanent improvements or modern human occupation. So in the case of some of those towns, since they were able to be dismantled and brought back to a relatively natural state, one can still consider it a wilderness. Ancient human occupation and impermanent developments like those towns, do not preclude the creation of a wilderness area. So the Congress can still decide, even if there's a building, an old building in a wilderness, they can still establish a wilderness under certain circumstances. And finally, we return to the quote, outstanding opportunities for solitude and or primitive and unconfined recreation, quoting the Wilderness Act again. Perhaps the easiest bullet point to understand, quote, wilderness provides outstanding opportunities for remoteness from sights and sounds of people and modified areas and for self-reliant recreation. So these are places where we can go and be independent. These are places where we can go and be free from loud cars, and be free from developments, towns, and things like that. And here's a picture, even though you can see Smith Point County Park in the distance, and this is on the beach, which is not technically a wilderness area. This was a gentleman I met who was cross-country skiing last week, which was pretty fun. This is a still or a GIF from Parks and Recreation. So now that we have a framework for understanding what wildernesses are, what they aren't, what they're for, and why we like them, how do we manage and preserve federal wilderness across the country? The four agencies that manage the National Wilderness Preservation System include the National Park Service, the folks that I'm working for today, the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Each of these agencies works cooperatively to manage over 800 federal wilderness sites scattered throughout national parks, throughout forests, throughout preserves, and other public federal lands. So depending on which wilderness you go to, you may encounter one of these different agencies. In 2014, so not too long ago, the Wilderness Act celebrated its 50th anniversary, and this map of all of the federal wildernesses at the time were published. So this map is actually already probably a little bigger now. At the time, the preservation system had expanded from around 9.1 million acres in 1964 when it was first established, to around 109 million acres. So 9.1 million to 109 million acres as of 2014. And again, it's probably quite a bit larger now. Of the over 800 wilderness areas contained within the wilderness preservation system, the National Park Service regulates the majority of the land in terms of acreage, with over, at the time of 2014, 43 million acres under its jurisdiction. So the slight majority of all wilderness is managed by the National Park Service. And you can see that on this, you can see we're the purple ones, right? And so some of these wildernesses, and quite a few of them are up in Alaska, which is really important. But if I were to zoom in, you'd see one teeny tiny little wilderness right here in our backyard. The largest wilderness is Wrangell St. Elias Wilderness. It's close to 10,000 acres. And the smallest is this teeny tiny little wilderness called Pelican Island Wilderness. It's just 6 acres. Our wilderness here on Fire Island is actually one of the smallest. The wildernesses that the National Park Service administers, it's just around 1,380 acres. So it's quite a bit larger than Pelican Island, but it's not quite so big as Wrangell St. Elias. And of course, remember when we were talking about the law before, it designated a minimum of 5,000 acres or enough to be manageable. And in the case of the Fire Island Wilderness, it's a relatively open space, it's easy to access, and it's easy to manage as a wilderness because we have these really defined barriers in the dunes and in the high tide line, which sort of define its boundary. So you wouldn't get a wilderness designated that was like a tiny little park in the middle of a town. So that brings us home to Fire Island with the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness. This is the photo that I was in front of before. I didn't want to waste time trying to set my background up again, so you'll forgive me for being in front of the William Floyd estate instead of in front of the wilderness. But I took this picture last week right after the snowfall that we had. It was really wonderful to be out there. It was so quiet. Wildlife was stirring. I could see other folks who were recreating and really enjoying themselves in the snow. So this is the Fire Island Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness, which is a really long name. I'll shorten it and say either the Fire Island Wilderness or the Otis Pike Wilderness, or the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness. This wilderness was established by an act of Congress, as most wildernesses are, on December 23rd, 1980. It was named after Congressman Otis Pike. It was, Otis Pike, the Fire Island High Dune Wilderness was and remains, today it's the only federal wilderness area in New York. So it was named after a congressman, Otis Pike, who was actually really important in establishing Fire Island National Seashore some like 15 years before. At approximately 1,380 acres, it's really tricky to manage. It's kind of tiny. It's one of the smaller ones, like I mentioned. And because of that, and because it's on this really dynamic barrier island, if you folks have ever been out to Fire Island, and I can tell you, every single day you go out there, it's just a little bit different. It changes in subtle ways, it changes in big ways, whether that's by the constant action of wind and waves, or the sudden upheaval of big storms like Hurricane Sandy, which broke through and created the breach, which some of you may be familiar with. This wilderness is divided into two segments. There's an eastern side of the wilderness and there's a western side of the wilderness. They are divided by a pre-existing private sort of public town beach, which is called Bellport Beach, or many of you may know it as Ho-Hum Beach, which is only accessible by town ferry through the town of Bellport. It encompasses a variety of different natural, habitats, ecosystems. It has dunes. It has some forests. It includes this beautiful swale area. It includes marshes, some of the biggest and best marshes we have in the New York, in the Long Island area, and a host of other unique ecosystems and natural features. So obviously, I think it's really important when we're thinking about wilderness to talk about some of the things that live in wildernesses. And we'll talk a little bit today about wildlife. The Otis Pike Wilderness is an important home to all sorts of different wild animals, from deer who graze its plants, foxes who dig dens for their little babies into the dune face, horseshoe crabs, which don't spend most of the year inside of a wilderness, but actually do come into the wilderness space in order to lay their eggs, and insects like butterflies. This little butterfly, we get monarchs, we get things like that, who feed on nectar from its flowers. We also get a host of other creatures. I've seen snowy owls in the wilderness. I see harbor seals lounging in the wilderness, sometimes in the marshes. You can see whales from the wilderness. They wouldn't be inside of the wilderness, of course. You can see turtles, you can see snakes, you can see snow buntings and yellow-rumped warblers and falcons and hawks and all sorts of other really neat things. When you visit the wilderness, you've got to keep your eyes open because you have a good chance of seeing something really cool when you're passing through, just one of these really amazing wild creatures. The natural landscape of the Fire Island Wilderness is incredibly dynamic. It's constantly in motion. The constant impact of waves helps to shape the wilderness's biosphere. It both feeds and prunes the plant communities that grow behind the dunes, even as it threatens occasionally to sweep over parts of the wilderness. When we have big storms, sometimes the ocean breaks through the dunes and flattens out the wilderness behind them. A host of different recreational activities are available from the Fire Island Wilderness. As I've mentioned, waterfowl hunting is really popular this time of year, fishing, backcountry camping, hiking, even photography, which I do, and the arts. We have people who come out to paint in the wilderness, which is really cool. And we have backcountry camping, we have people who stay overnight camping, and they'll do stargazing. And so there are all sorts of activities that you can do. Maybe one day you can join us live in person for one of our public programs, for one of our activities. Now I'm sort of wrapping up. I apologize for being quick. I want to leave time for questions here at the end, and I broke off before, so we'll save a little bit of time. What's really important I want to talk about today are some of the threats to wilderness. Wildernesses like the Fire Island Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness are not free from forces which may threaten their wilderness character. Some common threats include overuse, as the impact of human walking along trails can have an impact on the shape of the landscape. pollution, even if pollution isn't happening inside of the wilderness, pollution does affect wildernesses. Here on Long Island, I think, for example, we always joke at the park that, late June, early July is balloon season because we go through graduations and everyone releases their balloons into the sky. And then suddenly our wildernesses become filled with all these mylar helium-filled balloons, which is really sad to see, especially the way that that directly impacts the wilderness character and unfortunately can hurt the animals. So pollution, even if you don't think you're polluting a wilderness, if you're not careful, you could very well be polluting a wilderness. Invasive species, like a plant we see lately called Oriental bittersweet. In some places, you'll get things like bamboo, southern pine beetle, which is like not necessarily invasive in the sense that it's not necessarily outside of its range, but has been a problem in the wilderness in the last few years. All of those invasives pose a massive risk to native species. Oftentimes, they don't have to deal with the same issues, the same parasites and stuff like that native species have to deal with, and they can outcompete those species. So when we see invasive species, that can be a big problem. And then of course we have things like storms, like Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, which was depicted here in this photograph. These can do direct damage to the natural landscape of the wilderness. Many of you might remember when Hurricane Sandy passed through, flattened out many of our dunes, really changed the shape of the landscape in the Otis Pike Wilderness, and of course created the breach through Fire Island, the breach that we can still, and we often do still visit today. Very dynamic, very beautiful natural feature, which I can talk more about if folks are interested. Of course, here on Fire Island, we're very concerned about things like sea level rise and other impacts related to anthropogenic climate change. I can tell you firsthand, we have seen the landscape in the wilderness change a little bit. We're starting to notice that the vadose zone, which is the dry area of land between the top of the water table and the surface of the ground, that dry area is starting to thin, indicating the rising water tables, which is going to have all sorts of outsized impacts on the forests and other ecosystems within the wilderness. So even if a wilderness is preserved and nobody's polluting it and no garbage is moving in there, climate change is still something that can and does actively impact wildernesses all over the country, can and does impact our wilderness here as well. And so kind of wrapping up and coming here to the end, I want to talk simply, I just kind of want to end simply by asking why wilderness? I found a quote on the website wilderness.org that does a lot of advocacy for wildernesses. I thought this, for me, really summed it up. And the quote goes, quote, "As we become a more urbanized society with growing needs for space and energy, we often turn to wilderness as a resource. Yet wilderness is not just a resource to be developed. It has many human, natural, and economic benefits that we need to protect. Wilderness is a haven from the pressure of our fast-paced society. It provides us with places where we can seek relief from the noise, haste, and crowds that too often confine us. It is a place for us to enjoy with friends and families, strengthening our relationships and building lasting memories. In the web of life, wilderness helps to preserve a wide variety of natural life forms and contributes to more diverse plant and animal gene pools. While wild places are a great source of economic activity, especially in rural communities that surround them. Outdoor recreation contributes more than $646 billion annually to the economy, supports 6.1 million jobs, and generates nearly 80 billion in federal, state, and local taxes." And then unquote. So whether we prefer to look at wilderness from a spiritual perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a social perspective, or whether we're just looking at the bottom line when it comes to wildernesses, it's clear that these places are incredibly valuable to us as people. They're really important for our culture and our society. We need them, and we know, just looking at the wilderness, that they need us too, and hopefully you'll all join me in helping to preserve and protect the wilderness that you have here in your backyard. So I want to end by inviting you to come out to the Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness. Come meet a ranger. We'd be happy to talk to you all about what makes this wilderness special. We'd be happy to give you an idea of what you can do, where you can go, and how you can have fun when you're visiting the wilderness. We do live programs in person, whether it's a hike to the breach. We have a seal walk coming up. We have a beach cleanup coming up for Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday. We really need volunteers for that. So hopefully I'll see a few of you out to help clean up Wilderness Beach. And so, yeah, and I hope to see you soon. So just to finish off, my name is Ranger Kelsey. I'm a park ranger here at Fire Island National Seashore, and I'll be sticking around. It looks like we still have time. I wanted to make sure we did. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I hope you all enjoyed my presentation. And I hope you didn't mind me cutting out too much.
Oh no, Kelsey, that's just fine. Technical difficulties happen, and I'm so glad you came back. We did have a question in the chat asking where exactly would we find the Otis Pike and how would we get there?
Yes, Eileen, thank you for asking that question. That was the last thing I was going to end on, and then I forgot. So thank you for the reminder. The Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness is pretty close to us in Mastic Shirley. If you're familiar with the area, the eastern end of the wilderness begins at the western end of Smith Point County Park. If you're not super familiar with the area, I can give you directions. I'll tell you to go south all the way down William Floyd Parkway. You'll go over a small bridge and then you'll be on Fire Island. When you're looking off to the right, everything over there that you see, that is the Fire Island Wilderness. And then a ranger station, a little visitor center is on the right-hand side. The first exit in the traffic circle if you want to come in and ask for directions. Now that gives you access to the eastern end of the wilderness. You can also access the western end of the wilderness from Watch Hill. A ferry from Patchogue leaves to Watch Hill in the summers. It's kind of off season right now, but once it's running again, that's actually a really great way to get into the wilderness, and that's how most like campers visit. So it's pretty much right next to Smith Point County Park, just a little bit to the west of Smith Point County Park. Tara Ryan asks, and you guys are welcome to turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves if you have questions and you want to talk. Tara is asking what the difference between a wilderness and a preserve is. The differences are a little complicated. Wildernesses are preserves, but not all preserves are wildernesses, if that makes sense. Most wildlife preserves are managed specifically by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are not primarily concerned necessarily with things like access. Oftentimes preserves are off limits, or places that are just for wild animals, just for plants. Although each one is sort of unique in its own right. I would also say that wildernesses are unique in that you can't do things like run motorized vehicles through a wilderness, whereas with a preserve, if you're doing some kind of science project, if you're monitoring wildlife, for example, you may be permitted to use certain motorized engines under the laws. So preserves and wildernesses are a little different. They are absolutely related. And again, I would say most wildernesses are preserves, but not all preserves are wildernesses.
Question. What percent of Fire Island are the wilderness?
Oh, that's a good question. What percent of Fire Island is a wilderness? So the wilderness is about 7 miles long from one end to the other and does not include the ocean beach. The wilderness actually technically starts from the toe of the dune and goes to the northern shore up to the high tide line. So if you're looking at Fire Island's a 32-mile long barrier island. The Fire Island Otis Pike High Dune Wilderness is 7 miles of that. So less than half of all of Fire Island, much less than half of all of Fire Island. And then even that's set behind the dunes. So I'm not very good at math off the top of my head, but I'm thinking it's probably somewhere around, I want to say, gosh. It's about like 25%, maybe a quarter of all of Fire Island is wilderness. Of course, Fire Island is really unique in that it also has 17 private communities and several visitor sites that are not wildernesses, and includes the Sunken Forest Preserve, which is a preservation. But that's outside of the wilderness.
Does the wilderness run from beach to bay?
It runs from the toe of the dune all the way to the bay. So the ocean beach is not inside of the wilderness, technically. It starts right where the dunes start to pop out of the sand, where you can start to see the beach goes from flat to becoming a hill. It's that toe, that's where the wilderness starts.
I had a question, Kelsey. You
Yeah.
mentioned all the invasive species that have been growing.
Yep.
Does the Park Service manage that, or do you let the wilderness do what the wilderness is going to do?
Yeah, no. So generally speaking, the policy with the wilderness is that we want to let nature take its course. So if something natural is happening, let's say we're starting to see coyotes in the area or something like that. That's not necessarily something we would manage, because that seems to be the result of nature sort of taking course. And we want to be able to observe that and see what kind of impacts that's going to have on the area. That said, when you're talking about something like Oriental bittersweet or bamboo, those things don't get out into a wilderness on their own. They're usually introduced accidentally by people. Oriental bittersweet in particular is a kind of a really pretty plant. It has these gorgeous sort of orange and yellow berries, and people have traditionally planted it in gardens because it keeps those berries all throughout the winter. So it's something that you can see a little pop of color in your garden, even in the middle of the winter, like this time of year. Birds like to eat those berries. They poop those berries. Those berries are released into a wilderness area. So when you're looking at invasive species, usually the qualifier is going to be, was this introduced here by people intentionally or accidentally? And in the case of Oriental bittersweet, it's usually, accidentally brought here, but it's still brought here by people. So yes, we do manage wildlife, whether it's plants or animals, in wilderness areas, if and when it is the result of human activity. So if you were to drop off a bunch of cats in the wilderness, then we might try to take them to the animal shelter, because we don't want to see those in the wilderness because they're not naturally occurring. Somebody dropped them off, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does. And do you have any research programs happening throughout Otis Pike?
Yeah, actually, there are a lot of different programs. If you were interested in knowing the details, you could sort of pick the brain of one of our biologists. I mean, everything from monitoring ticks and mosquitoes, which is really important for the health of people who are visiting wilderness areas, to monitoring the impact of deer populations on the natural landscape, monitoring foxes, monitoring threatened and endangered species like piping plovers, monitoring the snowy owls we have out there. In the wilderness, we're doing a lot of monitoring of the salt marsh to see how sea level rise is impacting the salt marsh. The breach itself has been a huge research project. I mean, we've had universities and scientists from all over the country visiting the breach in order to observe it and to see how it changes. So yeah, there's a lot of really cool science happening in the wilderness. And I don't even know where to start.
Well, I was actually interested in the breach. How have you seen a difference in that area?
The breach has changed so much over the last few years. I visit the breach pretty recently on the 1st of January for our annual breach hike. We do those quite often if you guys want to join us on a monthly hike. And last time I went, it was very narrow. It's changed a lot. Just in the last few months, it's been narrowing quite a bit. There's always a possibility that it's going to close. There's always a possibility that a storm's going to happen and it's going to blow it right wide open. So I'm not going to say it's going to close soon, but it's narrow. I mean, you could throw a stone across it. Last time I went, you certainly could. So it's changed a lot over the years. It sort of started a little further west, and then a little further east. It shifted very far west, then it got really wide, and now it's starting to narrow. And I think we're moving towards a phase where it might start to close up under certain conditions, assuming, of course, no storms open it again. It's had a huge impact on the water. A lot of people will tell you the area in the bay right around it has been a lot cleaner. Now I use quotations to describe cleaner because I sort of describe it like you're flushing a toilet. The Great South Bay, we have all this nasty stuff going into the Great South Bay, whether it's human waste or nitrates from your gardens. All of that material ends up in the Great South Bay and it just sort of sits there. The breach becomes an opportunity to flush all of that material out into the ocean, which means, yeah, maybe the breach, the area around it is cleaner, but that's not necessarily solving the problem, because you're just moving the junk from one place to another. You're moving it from the bay out into the ocean. That said, I am really optimistic. There are all sorts of different groups, whether it's the Shinnecock or a place like Blue Point Brewery, that are investing in rehabilitation of the Great South Bay, whether it's by planting eelgrass beds or whether it's by creating oyster farms. There's a lot going on in the bay. Not necessarily, I'm going off topic now. The future of the bay, I think I'm optimistic about, cautiously optimistic about. But yeah, the area around the breach has just changed so tremendously over the last 10 years. How long is the boardwalk that starts at the visitor center? Eileen asks. Eileen, I have to say the boardwalk is a little short. You could probably walk it in around 10 minutes. It sort of tapers off, and then there's a dirt trail that takes you further along. And if you wanted to walk the dirt trail, I always tell people hiking in the wilderness, this is the best time of year for it, because you don't have to deal with the mosquitoes. You don't really have to deal with the poison ivy, although you don't want to be mindful of what's there because it can still make you itchy. Easier to avoid now, though. And of course, there's still ticks out, but when it gets cold, they stop moving as much and you stop seeing them as much. So it's much safer to hike this time of year. So if you wanted to go for a walk off of the boardwalk, now's a good time for it. That said, the boardwalk is there for convenient access. The boardwalk was actually quite damaged after Hurricane Sandy. And it was rebuilt, even though we're not supposed to build inside of wildernesses. There are certain laws, rules, and regulations that sort of take priority over wilderness management. So, for example, it's really important to us to make sure that the wilderness is accessible to people with a broad range of needs. So, a small boardwalk is there to make sure that anyone can walk or take a wheelchair, for example, into the wilderness if they want to. But it's a pretty short walk. You can do it in like 10 minutes. And then if you're feeling up for it, if you're feeling adventurous, you can do a much longer hike from the Wilderness Visitor Center to the breach at Old Inlet. It's about 1.7. It's actually now probably closer to 2 miles because of how much it's shifted. And you used to be able to walk the whole 7 miles across the wilderness, but from the opposite direction, you could walk maybe about 5 miles from Watch Hill over to the breach, 5.5 miles. No problem, Eileen. Thank you for asking. Tara's asking about hunting, why hunting is allowed in protected areas and what types of waterfowl are being hunted. All hunting that occurs on Fire Island is under New York State regulations. So you're going to be mainly hunting for waterfowl, wintering waterfowl, variety of different ducks. I'll tell you, most of what folks are catching right now are things like the buffleheads, which are these really cool little guys that you'll see on the bay. The hunting season ends at the end of January. It's relatively narrow compared to a lot of other states. And it depends on the time of year. Different times of year, you can hunt different things. Hunting is considered a primitive activity. Something that you can do whether you have, a bow or a rifle on your own. So it is something that a lot of wilderness areas permit. It's actually a really important part of the management of a wilderness area because it helps to sort of maintain a natural and balanced ecosystem, especially out here on Fire Island. We don't have a lot of major predators. And because of the overabundance of, available food sources, mainly coming from people, a lot of people like to feed ducks. You have this overabundance of birds or other wild animals, and that can have an outsized impact on the entire ecosystem. So when you're thinking about managing an ecosystem in a holistic way, in some places, hunting is a really valuable tool for maintaining a balanced and healthy ecosystem, and that includes inside of the wilderness. I hope that answers your question. Does anyone else have any questions? You're more than welcome to ask, and you're welcome to unmute yourselves or whatever if you want to ask it verbally, or we still have the chat if you want to drop it in the chat.
Okay, so while we're waiting, if anyone has any questions, yes, feel free to put it in the chat. But I would really like to thank Kelsey for giving us this very informative view of the wilderness on Fire Island. And thank you for sticking with us while we got through our technical difficulties. You all were very patient with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the understanding.
If you'd like to learn more about Otis Pike, Fire Island, and the wilderness and the seashore, please visit their website at nps.gov/FIIS. And our next program with Fire Island will be next February, Wednesday, February 9th at 7 o'clock. We will be discussing winter birding on Fire Island and in your backyard. And next month is also the Great Backyard Bird Count, the weekend of February 18th. And so we'll talk more about the activities that Fire Island is doing, the activities that our library is doing to do a bird count tally that weekend. So that program again is Wednesday, February 9th. To register, go to communitylibrary.org or give us a call at the library at 631-399-1511, extension 240. But again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Kelsey, and we'll see you all next time. Have a good night, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.